I'm Seamless, and today is Thursday, which means it's time for a new FL Basics tutorial, FL12 Basics tutorial. And today we're going to look at Harmless, another plugin that you have probably never seen me use, and by probably I actually do mean definitely, because I have absolutely never had a reason to use it. And the reasons for it are actually pretty similar to my reason for never using 3x Oscillator, is that pretty much its entire functionality is taken up by another, more superior plugin, Harmless. The difference being that Harmless is still a premium plugin, whereas Citrus was more recently made a free plugin for the users of the Producer Edition, and Harmless is a free plugin. So Harmless and Harmless, and if you've ever followed me on other Harmless related tangents, you probably heard me say stuff about how like Native Instruments Razor is basically like Harmless Lite. Harmless is literally Harmless Lite. If I remember correctly, Harmless was actually an experiment about using the additive engine that powers this plugin and also Harmless, about how it can be used and presented in a whole bunch of other cool things. Most of the functionality, actually all of the functionality inside Harmless, eventually made it to into Harmless, and to also have been a lot more complex. Harmless is pretty simple. It's just this one page. There's not a lot of extra options for a lot of stuff, and it's just a display of what it's doing, and there's really not a lot else to it. And you might think that might make it not a terribly versatile thing, but it's actually still pretty powerful. I hope you can't hear that. Anyway, like Harmless, you start off with a basic saw-ish kind of sound. Actually, I think the actual default is have a little bit of release engaged. I think that's actually what it was. But I'm turning release off because I want it to be a pure, regular, additive saw wave. Like Harmless, the way Harmless works is that it's an additive synthesizer. You might have heard the term subtractive synthesis, or even FM synthesis, or even wavetable synthesis, and then along that you might have also heard the term additive synthesis. And it is pretty much the polar opposite of what it means to be a subtractive synthesizer. However, subtractive synthesis is still involved in a lot, just every other kind of synthesis. The difference being that subtractive synthesis, you start out with basically a recorded complex waveform, like a saw wave. In additive synthesis, you build the saw wave out of individual harmonics. You can see up here in the spectral display when I play the note, how there are the harmonics that are being engaged, for when I play the note. Those harmonics would still be there if I were playing a recorded version of a saw wave. The idea being that each of those individual harmonics themselves are just sine waves, and that if you take and you calculate where each of the harmonics are being placed, and then you just play a sine wave at all of those values, you play them together, you will create the exact same sound as a result. And it turns out that's totally true. And that's what this synth is all about, is manipulating things based on that. It's not as clear-cut or obvious that it's doing that as Harmless is, because actually it doesn't really ever tell you that. It doesn't show or tell anything that it's doing, except for like the harmonic mask that's present up here. It even has this same mix function, which is exactly the way that the mix function works in Harmless. Pretty much everything to do with Harmless is present in Harmless. It's just a lot more complicated. You have a lot more control over what it's doing. You can see in the spectral display what it's doing is that it's attenuating particular harmonics based on what I have here. If I were to turn all of them on, then there's no difference, because it has all the harmonics that are just present for what the sine wave series is. But if I were to do something like this, you can see that I'm choosing to have on particular harmonics over others. Fun. You can also see that it's engaging more than just the one harmonic there. In Harmless, you have control over every single harmonic. In this one, it's a set of series. So if I had none of them on, it'd be totally off. But if I engage one of them, it's not actually one harmonic. It's a whole bunch of harmonics. And so you can control sort of the timbre position in that regard. And that's sort of the additive basis for how this all works. Now, as far as the regular stuff, there are a bunch of whole regular things. Like, for example, there's a filter built in. It certainly behaves like a regular filter. However, it is still kind of additively charged, though most of the fun stuff that you can do with filters inside Harmless are not really available here, but you can still do regular stuff. Like, for example, you can engage the, this is the envelope for the filter, and make plucks. Just like any regular subtractive synth. And it is pretty interesting. For those of you who are Harmor users, you might recognize this guy over here, the Grit. The bandpass. The Grit. You can see what's doing in the spectral display up there. It's moving the harmonics, kind of spreading them around in harmonic positions, which is exactly what the Prism does inside Harmor. Also vibrato, and then there's LFO. You see, there's a bunch of LFOs everywhere, and there's only one internal main LFO. And you can change the sign shapes. There's a whole bunch of different things you can do with it. It's really kind of interesting, but for the most part, like for example, if I had the frequency of the filter on, and I engage the LFO, it's this one LFO, and it's the same LFO that I would engage on every single other parameter that's here. Like the pitch. And, other parameters like turning on the phaser, which I have on frequency mode. The phaser is actually, it's still the same phaser that's present inside, Look at the spectral view up top. Ain't that special? So the phaser works the same way as Harmor's does. It has even a lot of the same options. It's just that it's not as. Actually, come to think about it, oh yeah. Well, the only thing that we don't have the ability to do is to create your own shape. They have a bunch of other shapes available, and they do different things. And you do have the rest of the controls. You have this oct, hertz, and then harm, which stands for octave mode, hertz controlled mode, or harmonic mode. And then you have LFO to control the width, the offset, and they have the amount, and like all of that is actually still the regular same control of the same phaser has inside Harmor. The difference between oct and hertz is which should be present in some other modes. Yeah, it's up here too in the resonance and the filter, and I think that's it. Yeah, it's basically weighting. Because if you look at frequency, you notice how the lower frequencies have more room in between them. That is an octave-based distribution of harmonics, where octaves have the same range. So from one harmonic to the next harmonic is one octave, and then the next harmonic to the next harmonic is actually half an octave, but then the fourth harmonic is actually full octave. There's twice as many harmonics in the second octave than there are in the first octave, and that's true for every ensuing octave. However, the distance between the octave harmonics is still the same for every octave. However, that is a radically different hertz value per harmonic between each harmonics. And if it were to be spaced to be representative based on hertz values, then the harmonics would look very different. And so the octave versus hertz distribution on things like the filter weighting, the phaser weighting, and that kind of thing takes into account those two different things just by the way they work. And it's just a different it sounds different. And it's not hugely different. Like if I were to just, you can kind of see that you can visually see the difference in the display up here, where on Hertz mode, the higher frequencies have what appear to be smaller pieces of movement, where the lower frequencies have a larger piece of movement. And that's the saying that like that space up there is actually the same hertz distance as it is in the lower values, versus the octave modes, where it is visibly the same distance the entire time. Wherein at the higher frequencies, the hertz difference between one pole and the other pole may be the same in terms of octave values, but they're actually like 10,000 hertz versus the distance that would be 100 hertz in the low end. That's the difference between those two things. There's actually this adaptive business. That's actually where it'll the width of the frequency of the filter for whatever version of it you're using will adapt to be different based on the lower frequencies and the higher frequencies, so that it takes that kind of thing into consideration, which is similar to the octaves and hertz mode, but it's not quite the same. Yeah. So there's also a unison built in, which works exactly the same as regular unison. You have different modes, not all of the modes that are present inside Harmor, but you do have different modes, which do different things. Good stuff. wherever you see this VEL button, this stands for velocity tracking, which I actually don't have on right now because I've set up FL to not actually track velocity for my keyboard input. And basically what it's saying is that it will track velocity and change the value, whatever the value that's on, like say the pluck amount based on velocity. So that like a harder velocity will be a harder pluck, or a lower velocity will be a less of a pluck, that kind of thing. You can map that to filter like amount for the envelope, the pitch value for unison, the harmonizer amount. The harmonizer works the same way as it does in Harmor as well, except for the fact that it has only these set options as opposed to the grid format that it has in the other one. Good times. Yeah, it does have built-in effects. These are normal audio effects. Everything above this section where we're talking about up here is all being done through a manipulation of harmonics. Whereas down here, this is all just post-processing. It's audio stuff. Compressors, reverb, delay, and chorus, that kind of thing. Even in Harmor, I tend not to use the internal effects too much unless they're not too important. Like just slapping on reverb and delay is usually enough to do whatever I needed to do, so I don't necessarily need to be too complex with it. But if I do need to be complex with it, I'm just going to use like a different kind of actual post reverb. There's compressor built in, and then one of the options of the compressor is actually distortion. So if you want to have distortion built in here, which can be cool. You know, normal quality and high quality setting for like CPU based things. Threaded versus if it's a single core load or a multi-core load. The Equalizer is really just a 6 pole. You see what it's doing up there. It's not that intense. This guy is actually it keeps the lower harmonics active even when they should not be. So like if I, for example, had a bandpass filter. If this were not on, we'd only hear the higher harmonics when I have the bandpass up at the higher harmonics. But if I had this on, it's ensuring that the lower harmonics are actually still there no matter what you're doing. This is pretty good if you want to have like a sub built in, but it's also good for even higher notes, just to ensure that you have the note still present. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? Over here we have the pitch setting. Pretty straightforward. And then this detune setting, which does exactly the same thing that it does in Tight Harmor, where it moves the harmonics away from the fundamental. Or to the fundamental. This function is actually very similar to what the frequency shifter does inside Massive, if you were wondering about that. It's just the way the direction it moves in, the way that it happens is a bit different. I don't really think anything else is terribly important. This is not really that a complicated piece of thing. You might notice that most of the timbre options, options, are sort of based on saw waves, and that's because if I kept the mix formation here at its default, the way that it was when I started, the mix went all the way on, turns it into a saw wave, because the difference between a saw wave and a square wave in terms of harmonic presence is this change that we created in the series. So if you have, whatever shape you choose and the timbre options, if you do this to it, it turns it into the square version of that. Not only that, but you see this custom option, and this is where you can load in your own sound for it to be resynthesized in terms of being a single cycle waveform. You can do that in Harmor too, only it's a bit more, again, complex. Everything about Harmless is present in Harmor and can be done better in every conceivable way. Harmless is literally Harmor Light, which is why I never use it, because it offers exactly nothing in comparison to Harmor. However, Harmor costs money, more so than just buying FL. So if you have FL, you have Harmless, and Harmless is good to go. And it is pretty valuable, especially for pretty regular normal stuff, because you can still use it like a subtractive synthesizer. It has filters, you can do super saws, you can do, any kind of regular subtractive stuff with it. And it does have some pretty interesting additive edges to it as well, like the phaser with the frequency mode, where instead of altering volume like it does with normal mode, it alters pitch. You can do some weird crap. There's also the purely additive functions of the grit change up here, the detuning, even some of the unison modes, the harmonizing, all of this stuff is all totally wonderful additive goodness, which is Harmless itself is billed as being an additive subtractive synthesizer, where its whole point is that you're able to do subtractive stuff, but you're able to give it an additive edge. And then you're, of course, able to do purely additive stuff, which not a single other thing can do. Literally not. Some of that can be done in Harmless. And there are other additive synthesizers out there, but almost none of them have the kind of capability that Harmless does. This is really me just talking about how cool Harmless is. But I'm doing Harmless because you do have Harmless. It's free. It's not a premium plugin. I will, of course, also do a video on Harmless because I like it a lot. Harmless is my favorite thing. I honestly would not exist, and I would not be able to do the kind of sounds that I do without Harmless because it's just so good. Wasn't this video about Harmless? Anyway, if you have any questions about this, please let me know. And always remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and all the other glorious stuff that you can do on YouTube. And as usual, have a nice day.